So depending on where you are from, it might be a different time for you. So I'm just doing technical things and making sure I'm getting feedback. So I'll get started in a moment. This is the first time I've done a YouTube video through LinkedIn, so it's been very much a learning experience. And basically asked ChatGPT how to do it. So I'm learning as I go. So we're at 1 minute past. I'll get us going formally. So my name is Stephen Clarke. I am an independent consultant. I work with my own little startup company, which is InfoGov NZ. I'm the lead and only consultant because I'm a sole trader. So I work in data and information management and AI. As part of my um, broader portfolio of work, I do voluntary work and have done since about 2006 on developing standards. And originally working with Archives New Zealand as a principal advisor to develop the Public Records Act standards. Some of those went on to become ISO standards, like the digitisation standard and our electronic record keeping system standard, which eventually became ISO 16175. So that's how I got into the international standards development world, and been pushing for this for a few years now, which is for us as a group, which is uh, the Records and Information Management Standards Group, to develop something to support the information management and record-keeping requirements of artificial intelligence. So I'll come into that in more detail. So that's a little bit of background, and that's what I'm going to be speaking about today is records management and ethical AI and the relationship with ISO standards. So I represent RIMPA as they are my institutional body. They're the way it works with an ISO is you have a nominating body. They're my nominating body, the institution that nominates and authorizes me to speak on behalf of the community. But I'm here today really to put out a shout out for the other hat which I wear, which is kind of related, which is within ISO. We have a joint committee between Standards New Zealand and Standards Australia, and we have a mirror committee, which is the International Review Group. We've launched our new LinkedIn presence. And that's why I want to do something today to speak to our community and feedback what we do, because I know there's lots of people that within New Zealand that look to us to represent them on ISO standards development and standards development in general. So this is about pulling back the curtain and showing how that whole process works. So to put it into context, each ISO technical committee, which is TC46, each technical committee has a subcommittee. In our case, it's subcommittee 11, which is archives and records management. And then within each subcommittee, you have working groups. And this particular one's working group 22, which is records management and artificial intelligence. And the way that works is that um, individuals nominated onto the working groups by their host standards body. So in my case, it would be Standards New Zealand, but because we have a joint mirror committee, which is called IT21 under Standards Australia, I'm sort of representing both at the moment. So I'm sort of straddling Australasia, but there are Australian specific representatives on the group as well. So you can have more than one individual from any jurisdiction. Currently, there are 38 countries represented on Working Group 22, and we formally established ourselves in Berlin in May of earlier this year, and this presentation was what it was the presentation I gave to the group in Berlin as a way of getting us going and setting out what I thought putting together what I thought was a great rationale for us to formally constitute ourselves as a group, and we have done so. So a lot of the work in here, I'm not going to take credit for. It was developed by the Chinese technical committee, and I'll let you know which slides that Zhao Mian and Wen Wei developed. So, yep. So this is sort of pulling, as I say, the curtain back on what we do in our working group. The key topics I wanted to speak about and want to share with you is how to use records management to implement AI, how to use AI to implement records management. They're two different things, and that really has a big impact on how you would write the standard and the perspective that you take. Why using records management to implement AI also becomes using AI to implement records management, because there's a recursiveness around that, and a little bit about why these distinctions matter. And we haven't fully landed on what the content of the standard is going to be at this stage, or even whether it's a standard, it could be a technical report. I know for most people that won't make much difference. That's really an internal ISO distinction. For our audience, most people don't make a real distinction between what a technical report and a standard is. But what you can do in a technical report is you can put guidance in, which you can't in a standard. Standard has to be, at least theoretically anyway, an unauditable and pretty dry document that sets out requirements. Whereas a technical report, you're allowed to put guidance and examples and things like that. And so we probably will end up with a technical report because it gives us greater leeway to put in supporting documentation and guidance and examples of why we're putting what we're putting into this particular product. So I thought it'd be useful to start by saying this is actually a really exciting development within the standards world. Most standards bodies have been around for the best part of 100 years or more. And this is the first time in history there's been a genuine global approach to standards. So all the big standards bodies in the world are all sharing the approach. Instead of having their own standards bodies which feed into ISO or choose or not to choose to go with ISO standards, we're all linked together. So there's IEC, for example, NIST in the US, the Chinese standards bodies, the EU is also on board. So what that means is that if a standard becomes an ISO standard, or technical report becomes an ISO technical report, it gets automatic adoption by those other standards bodies, which means if you get a standard for artificial intelligence through, it genuinely is a global standard. So the Americans, the Chinese, the EU standards bodies will adopt it and give it their own overlay number, but it will essentially be the same standard. And so you can see there's a little kind of took a little snapshot from the US standards mirror group, which is subcommittee 42. Well, their one's joint technical committee subgroup 42. And you may, since I started to do some of this work, people are much more aware now of the 42,000 series, which has become the kind of standard series for ISO standards. So I haven't looked at very industry-specific standards. The standards that I'll be looking at today are ones that are specifically for artificial intelligence in its broadest coverage, because there are like very, very specific ones for sort of medical devices or running factory systems. They don't really have a broad applicability, so I'm going to look at the ones that have a much broader applicability and the general audience would have an interest in. There are a lot of standards and frameworks out there. People will be aware of the EU AI Act. Read them all out. You can read it for yourself. And they all take a slightly different approach. I've highlighted the American National Institute of Standards and Technology because I think their risk management framework is arguably the best of the bunch, in my view anyway. There's a lot more coming out. So the Australian one came out, about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago now. That's pretty good as well. But there's new ones coming out all the time. But what we're trying to do is make sure that the underlying standards are the same globally, even if the localized guidance is specific. And of course, the localized guidance has to be specific to your particular legislative and jurisdictional practice, and of course the needs of your audience. There's obviously a relation to existing legislation and existing frameworks and practice in various jurisdictions. So that's why we have to try and keep the standards quite tight and a bit dry, because we can't get into too many specifics, because that's often happening at a local jurisdictional level in each country. And what might be acceptable from a social impact perspective in, say, China might not be acceptable for a social impact perspective in Singapore or the US, or the Japanese approach may not align with the approach in, say, Rwanda. So it's about understanding where the limits are to right standards so that you're not stepping on the toes of local jurisdictions. And so this is where I'm going to tap into the work that Zhao Mi did. She's the liaison with ISO IEC JTC Joint Technical Committee 42 with the US and more broadly, and we work together to chair and get wangle all the different people on the group and try and make it run as smoothly as possible. It is quite tricky when you've got 38 different countries and maybe 100 different people on the group. So you have to then develop a smaller drafting committee, editorial committee, and and do the administration on that. So there's a subgroup or a small cohort of us that do that within the working group. And Zhao Mi led the development of a liaison report, which I thought I would share with you. So it's copyright of Renmin University, and it's not an ISO product as such, but I know that she's happy for me to share this as long as I give attribution. And as a group, we did pitch into this as well. There was quite a few of us that put information into this process, and I mean, Stars Development's a pretty collegiate affair, and that's one of the other things I really like about it is we get to work together, and we don't always agree on everything, but we end up uh, with a product that eventually we all do agree with, or at least have settled our differences and landed somewhere that we're all happy to vote on and vote it through the balloting process. So standards do play an important role in supporting all sorts of industries, and I think in artificial intelligence is going to be an area that's really desperate to have standardization, because as a relatively it's new at a commercial level. I mean, it's not new; it's been around for sort of 40, 50 years, but in its commercialized and accessibility perspective, I think yesterday was the second anniversary of ChatGPT coming out, which really heralded the ability for the average user to start to use these products in a way that you didn't have to be a specialist. And I think that's where standards can start to play a much stronger role in trying to manage some of that wild westness that we're seeing out there. According to the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, record-keeping specifications should cover aspects relating to logging during the operation of high-risk AI systems, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those jurisdictional frameworks refer off to specific record-keeping requirements. However, there is no specific record-keeping and artificial intelligence requirements within the existing standards. A lot of the standards that are out there for artificial intelligence state the need to have information and records kept of processes for things like traceability, registering societal impact concerns, being able to manage bias, um, ethics, transparency, repeatability, explainability, etc. And they say that you should do these, but they don't actually set out how you should do this. So what we did is we looked at all the existing standards out there. We aligned the vocabulary. We looked at our existing management standards for records and did an aggregation of all the existing requirements across our product suite and through the guidelines, and then looked at the related standards and technical reports across the artificial intelligence world, and did the same thing. Looked at all the requirements where there was a record keeping angle or directly specified requirement, and brought them together into a single view. So, as I say, that there's legislation policy that we have to look at, and then standard support. So, what is the perspectives and gaps that we can fill? And it is those requirements that are set out in the SC42 standards that that set out the requirement to keep records of AI, but they don't tell you how to do it. And we felt that was our USP in the gap that we could fill within our committee. So we extracted the themes. At that time, I think there's a few more now. Well, I know there's a few more now, but at that time there's 55 AI standards out there in ISO, and we extracted the themes from the 38 most relevant. As I say, some of them go into very specific areas where they don't have broad applicability. We looked through those, we bundled them up, and we gave them a code so that we could map together requirements um, for the ones that had records management requirements in them, but didn't state how they were done. And you can see there, it's things like the AI management systems, the life cycle framework for artificial intelligence, software engineering systems, um, automation of AI systems, etc., etc. And the societal impact one, I think, is quite important as well. So we looked at all the domains of AI controls and the existing standards, and we bundled them up into uh, thematic streams, gave them a code, and then we looked at our own set of information management standards and codified those as well so that we could map across where a requirement was set out but not articulated within the 42,000 series, but where we had existing standards that already articulated those requirements. And what we found is that when we crunched it all down from the thematic approach and what we had and what was missing from the existing AI standards across the 42,000 suite and further, was those four core aspects of records management concerns across the AI standards, and that was creating records in an AI environment, because a lot of the systems overwrite or don't naturally create records. So LLMs, for example, they're very, very dynamic. There's no real record keeping underpinning them. How do you keep the records of changes within that environment, or which algorithms were used at which time? Capturing the records, again, the dynamism means that things might be happening at a very, very highly dynamic, um, fast-paced environment. So how do you capture how you're doing that? Is it audit logs, which are often within the AI standards, said you must keep audit logs, but at what level of aggregation, how often? The use and reuse of records in the AI environment, and records control and controlled logging, and that's understanding the metadata about the record keeping process, what's changed, who did it, was it authorized, all that stuff you need for explainability, transparency, accountability, etc. And then we mapped those requirements to our existing standards. That's where you see that sort of string of numbers under there. So it's not, um, don't expect anyone really to understand that. That was just our own internal process to understand how we mapped this all together. Um, and what were the things that we knew we had to address, what societal and market need and target audiences, the process for managing records by design in AI, what the risks and benefits are, what the principles should be for information management AI systems, what the challenges are, the specific features that we would need to think about when it comes to creating, capture, classification, indexing, access control, etc., etc., and particularly disposition of records in AI. That's a really contested area. The relationship between AI-enabled systems and record systems, and that comes back to the difference with having AI for information management or information management for AI, and I'll come back to that later. Um, and what did our audience need to know? But also dividing that audience from being the traditional audience of our committee for information managers, whereas we have to take a different approach and have a less um, an audience that would have less familiarity with the terms and products we already had. So how do we write this in a way that it's applicable for the SC42 audience of technologists, ethicists, and professionals undertaking these processes within their organizations? So where did we get to? Well, we came to the conclusion uh, that we needed a standard. So that's unsurprising, but it then set out, well, how does that map, and what are the issues that we kind of really need to address? And when we looked at the AI management system standard, we mapped that with them. That AI said that you've got to have life cycle management, which doesn't really tell you to do it. It says that you've got to keep information for interesting parties. You've got to assess impacts. You've got to keep data for AI systems. But again, it doesn't tell you how to do that. So we mapped it to how from the existing standards and within our information management practice, how that could be achieved. And that's where these codes come from. So AI system would be, documenting the system, documenting controls and classifications, and documenting things like privacy, and um, documenting transparency, documenting processing, etc. So that was what would feed into our standard. So as I say, I'm pulling back the curtain because this is the sort of the stuff that users of standards don't normally get to see. This happens in the background, and all you really see is the final standard. So what we're just trying to get is that we tend to be quite a rigorous approach to how we do this, and people often ask us why it takes 3 years to make a standard from end to end. This is part that we can do it more quickly, but it does take time to do some of this foundational crunching, data crunching, and understanding what was required. So we needed to develop it with Subcommittee 42 for it to really have traction and be useful globally. And through that, it would become a de facto global standard. And we have nominated a liaison committee and a member to achieve this. So this presentation was from me originally. I did it. And the two subcommittees of JTC1, Joint Technical Committee 1, which is Subcommittee 42. So that's the Global Joint Technical Committee, ST42 on artificial intelligence. The two that we have the strongest overlap with and who we're going to liaise with are Working Group 2 on data and Working Group 3 on trustworthiness. So our kind of opening salvo was that for artificial intelligence and automated decision making in particular, to have any hope of being ethical, repeatable, transparent, explainable, governed, trustworthy, and or accountable, we need to maintain full and accurate records of the source training data, inputs, processes, and outcomes. Otherwise, we just have to take it on trust, which I'm not sure the global market is quite ready for yet. So I think there's an expectation out there that the way AI done should be explainable and accountable and take account of ethics and legislation. And if you don't have record keeping, you have to take it in trust because there's no records. It's down to human memory then and what people said. So we pulled together an original, a sort of first draft of a table of contents. It's moved on since then, but as you can see, this is how we start out. By doing this, we can then allocate the work to different people on the drafting committee and the working group. So when we chunk it up into these headings, we're in a position because there's a lot of work involved, and obviously not one person's going to write all this. So we can dish out the work to different countries and different people that are going to do the doing and do the writing. And there's some background work as well. I mean, I'm pushing my own agenda on ontology for artificial intelligence and how we can use knowledge graphs and that sort of stuff to do some really interesting stuff with information management, because of course this is beyond human scale. We're not expecting humans to do this. This will be standards for how the systems themselves create and capture records. And of course, there will be a human in the loop, some human oversight, and then there will be some human decision making. But for the vast majority of it, it's just beyond the scale of humans to do, which is true of information management in general. And standards apply at multiple stages of the approach when it comes to data and information for AI. It's not just one area. So you can see the sort of things we've bundled in there. There's different outcomes. So we need to keep records for things like technical robustness, cybersecurity control, data supervision, human rights, privacy, security, transparency, etc., etc. So there's different perspectives that drive us to keep records, and not just people often think it's just for legislative or regulatory compliance. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why you have to do this. And of course, at the moment, the number one use case for artificial intelligence is actually information management. And that's not just within my domain or the information management domain, this is true globally, and this is the IDC report saying that knowledge management applications are actually the number one application for artificial intelligence. So information management is in of itself one of the key applications that we're using artificial intelligence for. So again, it comes back to that kind of concept that we're doing artificial intelligence for information management or information management for artificial intelligence because the requirements are different, subtly different in some cases, pretty different in others. So one of the things we have to do is develop a vision. What does records management for AI look like? To start to establish our goals and objectives. What is it we want to achieve from standards development, and what do we want to achieve as records managers and information management when it comes to applying artificial intelligence? How we go for a step-by-step basis of understanding the use case and why we'd want to use AI for a particular outcome or business process. So understanding the benefits and possibilities, defining the objectives. One of the key things from an information management perspective is understanding the data and information availability and quality. One of the key things we're hearing over and over again within AI is that the data quality is a huge barrier to undertaking AI because of decades of really poor information management, poor classification, poor retention and disposal, poor version control, not enough segmentation of final versions from draft versions. When you're doing the web scraping and or you're doing the entering data into the training systems for AI, that's often not well delineated, so you don't get great outcomes. So how we invest in data management practices, data governance frameworks, and standards is a really critical perspective from an information management perspective. And the same goes for those trust frameworks, and I say archives and records because in the New Zealand context, we we delineate differently and make a distinguishment between archival practice and so what goes to the archives and what is done in day-to-day business, being a sort of information manager or a chief data officer, whatever your role is within a current business. We make a distinction about that in New Zealand. That's not the case in other jurisdictions. They see it as all the same job, and it's a continuum or a spectrum, and that often causes challenges when writing standards because although the practice here in Australasia and in other parts of the world is quite disparate and delineated, that's not the case in a lot of so it's not that's it's seen as all one activity in places like China and a lot of European countries, for example. So you have to evaluate the technical capability, so what's realistic when it comes to being able to capture records, and then the use case assessment process. And if you do take a use case assessment process for undertaking AI, which I strongly recommend that you do, the issue that I'm seeing at the moment is organizations are picking up AI and then looking for things to use it on instead of saying what's the business problems that we have or what's the opportunities in our organization to uptake AI in order to be an asset to what we do. Um, Grabbing the thing and then using, when you've got a hammer, every problem's a nail. That for me is really, really problematic. And I think that's where we're seeing the real problems in organizations really coming a cropper is by kind of using AI without thinking through the use case, understanding the risk profile, understanding the records need to create and maintain, what quality goes in, what quality comes out, and then understanding what the processing is in the middle. Is it black box? Is it white box? Is there a human in the loop? All those kind of considerations. As a feedback loop. So you're doing quality analysis. Are you assessing the outputs of your LLMs? Are you assessing and going back and improving the input into your training data? And if you are cleaning up your training data, is the cleaned up training data being repatriated back into the original system in your organization so you're getting the benefit of the cleaned up data in more than one place? Because if you clean it up just for AI, you don't clean it up in its source system, you're going to get things are going to be out of whack. And it seems to me a kind of waste of money not to do that. And then there's thinking around how we might do information system enhancement, because a lot of information management systems are underinvested in right now, and probably not fit for purpose for AI. And I'm gonna have to look at what's the user, customer, and citizen engagement, and of course, education. How do we educate users and our stakeholder groups about why we're doing this, how we're doing it, and that's where we start to have the conversations around explainability and clarity and accountability, etc. So, in a design and implementation roadmap, and one of the things I thought was kind of useful to look at is this is an existing standard, uh, our technical report 24 030, and it sets out AI use cases. And I've just taken this is just the headings from the standard, and in blue there are the actual use cases. I like the idea of, given that we've gone to all that effort to set out different use cases in different contexts, still start off with a general use case, which is kind of funny, but it's also just the way the ISO template works. And what I thought was really interesting, given that over 50% of all the use cases globally were for information and knowledge systems, that's not set out in there. And it says something about the low maturity for information and knowledge management within within the technology and AI communities, that they just didn't see this as being, back then in 2021, didn't see this as being absolutely critical to how we do AI and how businesses want to use it. I mean, I would say that knowledge bases are, for example, probably more of a pressing issue for most organizations than home service robots. So this is a bit of my own IP. What I presented to the standards committee is a potential way forward, and that's to put a model in for use case identification and prioritization. But the data profile being one of the key outcomes of that, understanding high risk to low risk data. But you've also got to understand the business value of why you're doing AI, the speed to delivery, because if you're going to take a year or 2 years to deliver an AI project, it's probably not going to fly, and the business readiness. Do you have the skills in the organization? Do you have the technology? Have you got the guide rails in place? Have you thought about your policies? Have you thought about ethics? Do you have data and information registers? Do you have a way of being able to capture your algorithmic processing? Have you made sure you don't have black boxes? And if you do, there's guardrails. So all that thinking that you have to do to be business ready. I propose that you kind of put a use case model in there, give your business value, work with your organization and your key stakeholders to come up with a business value determination out of 10 for business value, for speed to delivery, for business readiness, and of course for the risk profile for the data. Is it good quality data? Has it got lots of contextual metadata? Is it clean, etc., etc.? And then you understand your risk profile, and from that you've got basically 4 dimensions. You put it into a little spreadsheet or whatever tool set you've got, and you get a little bubble diagram, and therefore you can understand what is a good use case and what's not a good use case. If it's up in the top right quadrant, it's probably a good use case. If it's got a big bubble, it's probably an even better use case. If it's in the bottom left quadrant and it's got a small bubble, it's probably something you shouldn't touch with a barge pole, and highly risky. It's going to take too long to do, poor business value, and the business isn't ready to do it, and it's high risk. So this is my own kind of of IP that I'm putting forward. Whether it will get into the final standard, I don't know. But really, that's not important. It's more about understanding that you have to have a use case identification process. And as I say, a lot of organizations are jumping into doing AI without really understanding the risks, the barriers, the benefits, the business readiness, etc. And that will eventually come back to bite you in the butt at some time. Got to think about the ethical considerations. Um, I mean, it depends on the industry that you work in. The ethical considerations may be higher in the public sector, for example. They'll certainly be higher if you're dealing with children. They'll certainly be higher if you're dealing with vulnerable communities. They'll be higher if you're making automated decision making for human rights and entitlements. They'll be higher if you're dealing with things like medical products and outcomes. So yeah, you'll only know within your industry what the key ethical considerations are, but have a process for understanding those, and have a model for being able to understand your risk profile, and therefore the level of standardization and pre-thought that you need to put into developing your ethical AI guidelines and policies before you start putting these tools in place. We have to balance the humans and the machines. So just because you can do something and automate it doesn't mean that you should. And in certain contexts, you might not have a human in the loop. In others, you might have a human on the loop, so just oversight and checking and quality control and assurance. And others, where it's really high risk, you might want to have, you may have to have, legislatively speaking, have a human pressing the button to authorize any decision-making process. And of course, just because there isn't a human in the loop doesn't mean that, that no one's accountable. The organization is still accountable for the outcomes of AI, even if it doesn't have a specified human being making these decisions or being accountable. But over time, the courts will make determinations on that. But it's probably better to have thought about this up front and understanding who is responsible and waiting to find out through the court system and through litigation or huge external embarrassment. So from a high level perspective, we should be looking at developing an ethics and trust framework, developing a governance and stewardship model, and start to build together things like reference architectures, so we can set those expectations and how these things might be achieved. So what sort of stuff goes into your ethics and trust framework? Well, we've already touched on risk profiling. You've got to look at identifying your audience and stakeholders, understanding and managing the risks, impacts, and harms, measuring, prioritizing those risks, establishing your risk tolerance position, implementing your risk management governance. And what sort of things should you think about? You know, is it safe? And that's safe in the context of in the scientific community they have a safe model for data. There's privacy concerns depending on what you do. There's a high likelihood that you're going to have uh, fair principles and dealing with harm and bias. Does it need to be transparent, explainable, etc., etc. When it comes to information management, there are some really obvious use cases that are out there at the moment, and ones that I've worked on myself in recent years have been around retro meta tagging things, shared drives, which often don't have really good classification and tagging on them for things like OIA, privacy, retention and disposal, the GDPR considerations, as the financial and fintech AML/CPT considerations that you have to tag on there, as the Maori and or Indigenous data sovereignty. How do you tag all that content? So, for example, if you're going to migrate a shared drive uh, from on from on-prem to a cloud product, and there's Maori content on there that can't be offshore. How do you segment that? If you're moving from SharePoint um, on-prem to SharePoint um, online, what can go and what can't go on that, because of the stuff that you for might be for uh, national security or privacy or other considerations. How do you segment the material that can go offshore from that that can't? So how do you do that retroactive meta tagging of content? Um, how do you do text extraction, text recognition, and the retro meta tagging process to apply the tagging once you've identified that material? So there's a lot to think about in there, and I'm unfortunately seeing organisations rushing to doing this without doing that sort of depth of thinking on the risk profile and on the expectations from their stakeholders and third parties on how their data is managed. And I did a research piece about 2.5 years ago, and looked at all the machine learning and AI use cases that I could find out there across the world what I found is almost half of them, or it might be slightly over half, I'll have to go back to my research report, but anyway, around half of all use cases for using artificial intelligence and machine learning for information and records management was retention and disposal. That's something a lot of organizations are grappling with, where they've got big data, they've got really poorly managed, unstructured information and records management practice. How do they how how do you get your information AI ready? A lot of that has to do with disposal of aged, inaccurate, or superseded material. Of course, you have to apply the correct detection disposal authorities and legislation to do that. So that's the big one that I can see. So I also did a research report again about, I think it was about 2 years ago as well. So this might be slightly out of date, but it's got the most of them. So um, what am I pick out here? I think implications of artificial intelligence, machine learning, quite quite important. Risk management is bias in AI systems definitely uh, a big consideration, and trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is mentioned a lot in AI, but trustworthiness only really comes through from keeping records that are keeping evidence that's of a trusted level, and that's record keeping. And it's kind of interesting that a lot of these standards, from the tech perspective, fall over themselves to try and find different ways of not saying this is basically record keeping and you should do that. But that's so a lot of these concepts are in the standards, they're just not articulated because they're often written by technologists or by AI specialists that don't really have the maturity in artificial data management that we may have. Yeah, I mean, robustness of neural networks is really important. How do you keep records of that? And ethical and societal concerns is what full square within the wheelhouse of information and records management professionals. We have a massive overlap as well with security and privacy. Obviously, we deal with our privacy legal teams, and we deal with our cybersecurity um, colleagues. But again, although they've got deep knowledge in their subject matter domains, they're often not specialists in how you achieve those outcomes when it comes to records management, keeping good, robust records of those activities and what you need long term. Particularly longer term, I see a lot of stuff. Records might be created, but they're not captured, or they're disposed of way before they should be, which is obviously a problem. So some of these ones that were in development may well have been published by now. Explainability, I know, has been published, and that's a critical one for us. Same goes for our treatment of unwanted bias, transparency and taxonomy of AI systems. I would argue ontology as well, as I always do. Verification and validation analysis of AI systems can only be done by keeping records. How do you validate or do verification? By testing against the records that you captured. Again, a lot of these requirements are out there, and that's what we found by crunching through them, but they don't tell you how to do it, and that's what we're going to put into our standard because, of course, records management practice is how you achieve these outcomes. And then finally, privacy protection and audit certification. That's kind of a big deal for us too. Synthetic data, I think, is interesting, and one of the problems I'm definitely seeing with the proliferation is the lack of classification and meta tagging of synthetic data, and what that means is data that's created by AI itself, so that the information that's been created by AI is going back into organizational information systems and proliferating on the internet, which means is when you're doing web scraping or you're putting organizational information into these systems to do training or develop LLMs, what you're doing, putting synthetic data back in, which is s- potentially very problematic because the system's training on its own created data um, instead of human data. So you're going to get hallucinations, you're going to get problems with that. and you get the tail, the head eating the tail, which as this proliferates, we're going to have it's going to be a real problem. And if you don't, one of the records management classifications, in my view, should be that all AI generated content is meta tagged as AI generated. So that further down the line, we can start segmenting this because I think we're creating a big problem for ourselves at the moment by creating a lot of AI generated stuff but not tagging it. So how do we identify that? And a week's time, a month's time, a year's time, 7 years time, 30 years time, however long this stuff needs to be kept for. We're kind of still creating problems for ourselves even now when we know that these issues need to be addressed. So yeah, so my view is that Gen AI is going to be stymied by the lack of good quality training data, and that's already happened. We've hit the point where the good quality stuff is already being used up, and it's diminishing returns on investment. However, on the other side, using artificial intelligence to do information management, I think is the only way that we're going to remediate that 30 years of digital landfill, as I call it, which is the information sitting in organizations incredibly poorly managed, poorly classified, poorly described. We all know, I mean, most of us have been involved in processes where we've had to migrate from one platform to another, or migrate shared drives to SharePoint, or whatever it might be, or migrate um, textual fields from structured databases into systems, and hitting all sorts of problems with privacy, access, breaching HR legislation, commercial and confidence, national security, etc., etc. And we're going to have to really get onto that now that the tools like Copilot and Duet and other things are becoming widely accessible in information management systems, and that old security by obscurity is no longer working for us, and these systems are surfacing all sorts of stuff that shouldn't be generally accessible. They're also surfacing a lot of stuff that's incorrect because the systems have got multiple versions. We don't make it clear what the final or authoritative version is, so the system doesn't know. That's where you get what they call hallucinations, which we can call it a hallucination, but it's just the system's spitting out a determination from poor quality information that's been put into it in the first place. And standards will play a key role in doing this. So let's kind of I wanted to say really because I've covered the presentation. I had some other some other spare slides and bias, and if the kind of there's other stuff got in there as well. But rather than me speak much longer, I want to give the opportunity for um, the audience to ask any questions. So you can unmute. I was getting feedback, so I've switched my speakers off. So I'm going to put my speakers back on. So if anybody has any questions, at the moment. So if anybody's got any questions that they want to pitch, unmute yourself and ask. I should be able to hear you, or if you type it into the chat. I don't know if the chat should be available. So I don't know if there aren't any questions or whether I'm just not hearing them. As I say, this is my first pitch at this, so that technically I might have stuffed up somewhere when it comes to being able to hear you or see anything from the chat. So that was quite a technical presentation, and it was very kind of specific to information management. But if you're interested in uh, broader intelligence topics, I'm happy to do follow up talks on more general issues. But I'm always obviously going to be coming at this from a data and information management perspective because that's my passion and my subject matter expertise. So if you want to get in touch with me, I'll put my email in. Oh, wrong one. I'll put my email in. I'll put it in the chat. Oh, wrong one. I'll put my email in. I'll put it in the chat. Oh, wrong one. I'll put my email in. I'll put it in the chat. Oh, wrong one. And see if I can manage the sharing. I can. It's not immediately obvious how to do this. Oh, well, if there aren't any more questions, I'll end the stream here and thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it and hope you got value out of this. So, yeah, remember if you're interested in the work of the International Review Group and standards development for this particular sector of information management and AI, you can contact us through the LinkedIn page. So that's where you can see what's going on. You can contact us through there as well. It's a bit weird for me because it's about a 10-second delay when I speak, so it's kind of weird hearing yourself when you're speaking. Oh, well, I've got a question come through. How long do you think it will take for organizations to focus on data quality, data governance, management, and buy-in, not to focus on tools? I feel like data governance is hard to sell to others. Yep, it's the perennial question. I don't think that uh, that's going to change. I don't think there will be a sudden switch over. Um, I think our role and the role of organizations is to understand the risk context and the benefits that good information management can bring. So it's not about stopping one and doing the other. I think we'll have to do them hand in hand because realistically, organizations aren't going to just stop everything and put the policies in place and put the data quality in place. In fact, it hasn't stopped them so far. I mean, I've seen lots of instances of AI tools being put in and really poor quality data being fed into them. So, yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is buy-in is hard, but I think for us with AI, the answer is in the problem for once, and that is that the problem of AI is surfacing poor quality data and poor quality information, but also has the ability to remediate it so that you can use AI and machine learning tools, as I've spoken about, to do a lot of that retroactive meta tagging and remediation. I've got a presentation on that. If people are interested, that's one I could do as a follow up on how I did a proof of concept on developing artificial intelligence tools to do information management. So yeah, no, I'm sorry if that didn't really answer your question. I'll be honest, I don't think it is answerable. I think it's more of a how do we raise our organizational maturity to understand the value that we bring. And as there's no further questions, I might just close this for today. A couple of minutes before the end of the hour, anyway. Right. So thank you everyone for your time. If you've got any questions for me that you didn't want to ask me today, please follow up. My email is up there, and please follow the IRG, the International Review Group for New Zealand for ISO standards. See you next time.